Picture yourself in a small plane flying over the Amazon rainforest. Below you, nothing but green, an endless carpet of trees stretching to every horizon. Dense, impenetrable, untouched. It looks like the world before humans, like wilderness in its purest form. But what if I told you that beneath that green canopy, invisible from above, lie the ruins of cities, roads that once connected thousands of people, earthworks so massive they rival anything built in ancient Europe? And what if I told you that roughly 1 million people once lived down there in a civilization so sophisticated it engineered the forest itself? Then it vanished, not slowly, not gradually, almost overnight in historical terms, and for centuries nobody believed it had ever existed at all. See, we've been told a story about the Amazon, that it's a pristine wilderness, that the indigenous people who lived there were small nomadic tribes, living lightly on the land, never numbering more than a few 100,000 across the entire basin. This wasn't just conventional wisdom. It was scientific consensus. Textbooks stated it as fact. The Amazon, we were taught, was too poor in resources, too hostile to agriculture, too difficult to sustain large populations. Cities? Impossible. Complex societies? Couldn't happen. The jungle doesn't allow it. Except the jungle was hiding something. And it's only in the last few decades that we've begun to see what's really down there. This is the story of a lost civilization that shouldn't exist according to everything we thought we knew about the Amazon. It's the story of Spanish conquistadors who described cities and roads and populations in the millions, only to be dismissed as liars and fantasists for 500 years. It's the story of soil that's too perfect to be natural, of satellite technology that can see through trees and reveal geometric patterns carved into the earth 1,000 years ago, of archaeologists who risked their reputations to say what the data was screaming. We got this completely wrong. And it's the story of a catastrophe so total, so devastating, that it erased almost all evidence of these people from history. The jungle grew back over their cities. The forest reclaimed their roads. And for centuries, scholars looked at the endless green and assumed nothing had ever been there. But something was there. Someone was there. Roughly 1 million people living in interconnected communities, building earthworks that required moving millions of cubic meters of soil, managing the forest like a vast garden, creating a civilization without stone, without the wheel, without metal tools. And then, in the span of a few generations, they were gone. If you're into deep dives like this, we've actually put together some fascinating prehistoric stories in the Sleepy Time History book over at sleepytimehistory.com. But right now, we're going into the jungle. Because the first person to tell the outside world about these lost cities, nobody believed him either. February 1542. Francisco de Orellana and his men were dying. They'd left Quito months earlier as part of Gonzalo Pizarro's expedition to find El Dorado and the fabled land of cinnamon. Instead, they'd found starvation, disease, and an endless maze of rivers cutting through jungle, so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Pizarro had turned back. Orellana hadn't. With about 50 men in a hastily built brigantine, he'd made a desperate decision. Follow the rivers east, all the way to the Atlantic if necessary. It was either that or die in the jungle. What happened next would be recorded in obsessive detail by Friar Gaspar de Carvajal, the expedition's chronicler. And for nearly 500 years, almost nobody believed a word of it. Because according to Carvajal, once they descended from the Andes and entered the main channel of what we now call the Amazon, they didn't find wilderness. They found people. Everywhere. The first settlements appeared gradually. Small villages on the riverbanks, clusters of houses visible through breaks in the vegetation. Then the villages got larger. Then they stopped being separated by wilderness at all. Carvajal describes entering stretches of river where settlements lined both banks continuously for leagues. Not miles, leagues. 1 league equals roughly 3 miles. He's describing urban corridors extending for dozens of miles without interruption. The friar wrote about fortified towns with defensive palisades, about plazas large enough to hold thousands of people, about roads leading inland from the river, well-maintained and clearly heavily trafficked, about warehouses stocked with maize, manioc, dried fish, and preserved meats. These weren't temporary camps. These were permanent settlements with infrastructure, with food security, with populations large enough to build and defend significant fortifications. And they weren't empty. Carvajal describes canoes coming out to meet the Spanish, sometimes dozens at once, filled with warriors. He writes about pottery so fine and well decorated it could have come from Spain, about organized resistance that forced Orellana's men into several pitched battles. At one point, they encountered female warriors fighting alongside the men, which led to wild speculation about the legendary Amazons and eventually gave the river its name. But here's what's really important in Carvajal's account. It's not just that he saw people. It's the density, the organization, the clear evidence of a functioning complex society. He describes one province ruled by a chief so powerful that other settlements paid tribute to him. He writes about guides who knew the river for hundreds of miles, who could predict where villages would appear, who warned the Spanish about which territories were hostile and which might trade. This wasn't a handful of scattered tribes living hand-to-mouth in the jungle. This was a civilization with political hierarchy, with trade networks, with enough surplus food production to support specialized craftspeople making that fine pottery, with enough population density to mount coordinated military resistance against armed Europeans. The Spanish were terrified. There were 50 men in a single boat, moving through territory controlled by populations that clearly numbered in the thousands, maybe tens of thousands in each major settlement cluster. They couldn't stop for long, couldn't establish control, could barely even rest. They just kept moving, fighting when they had to, fleeing when they could, documenting everything as they went. The expedition took months. They traveled nearly 3,000 miles from the Andes to the Atlantic, arriving in Venezuela in August 1542, exhausted, depleted, but alive, and carrying a chronicle that described an Amazon river teeming with humanity. When they got back to Spain, when Carvajal's account was published, the reactions were mixed. Some believed it, some were skeptical. But the story didn't really die. It fed into the whole El Dorado legend, the idea that somewhere in the South American interior lay wealthy civilizations waiting to be discovered and conquered. Generations of explorers went looking, following Orellana's route or variations of it, and they found nothing. Empty jungle, a few small tribes living in scattered settlements, no fortified towns, no roads, no warehouses full of food, no provinces ruled by powerful chiefs. The Amazon these later explorers encountered looked exactly like the Amazon we thought we knew. Sparsely populated, hostile to agriculture, impossible for large-scale civilization. So the conclusion seemed obvious. Orellana and Carvajal had lied, or exaggerated, or hallucinated from fever and starvation. Their account was dismissed, filed away as another conquistador fantasy, another tall tale from men trying to justify failed expeditions and attract new investors. For 4 centuries, that was the accepted wisdom. Carvajal's chronicle was historical fiction, interesting, maybe useful for understanding Spanish colonial ambitions and propaganda, but not actual evidence of Amazonian civilization. The scientific consensus hardened around a simple narrative. The Amazon couldn't support large populations, therefore it never had. Orellana saw what he wanted to see. Except here's the thing nobody considered until very recently. What if Orellana saw exactly what was there? And what if, by the time anyone thought to seriously look again, it was already gone? By the mid-20th century, the academic consensus on the Amazon was ironclad. Not just skeptical of Carvajal's account, actively hostile to the very idea that complex societies could have existed there. The jungle, according to the dominant scientific framework, was what ecologists called a counterfeit paradise. Beautiful to look at, deadly to live in, fundamentally incapable of supporting the population densities and social complexity that characterize real civilizations. This wasn't just one researcher's opinion. This was environmental determinism at its peak, a worldview that treated geography as destiny and assumed that certain environments simply couldn't produce certain outcomes. The Amazon's thin, nutrient-poor soils became the centerpiece of this argument. Most Amazonian soils, scientists correctly noted, are terrible for agriculture. The jungle looks lush because it's efficient at recycling nutrients, not because the soil itself is rich. Cut down the forests, try to farm the exposed earth, and within a few years you've got exhausted land that can barely support anything. This is why modern Amazon agriculture often fails so dramatically, why cleared rainforest so often becomes degraded pasture. The logic seemed unassailable. If you can't farm intensively, you can't produce food surpluses. Without surpluses, you can't support specialized craftspeople, administrators, priests, or warriors. Without specialization, you can't build complex societies. Therefore, the Amazon never had complex societies. QED. The person who crystallized this thinking into academic orthodoxy was Betty Meggers, a profoundly influential archaeologist at the Smithsonian Institution. Her 1971 book, Amazonia, Man and Culture in a Counterfeit Paradise, became the definitive text. Meggers argued that the Amazon's environmental limitations placed an absolute ceiling on cultural development. Small villages, yes. Simple subsistence patterns, certainly. But cities, states, elaborate social hierarchies, impossible. The environment wouldn't allow it. She called it the law of environmental limitation of cultural development, and she applied it ruthlessly to any evidence that contradicted her model. Elaborate pottery must have been imported from the Andes or developed by small elite groups. Large archaeological sites, probably occupied by small populations over very long periods, making them look more substantial than they were. Reports of dense populations, colonial exaggeration or misunderstanding. The framework was so totalizing it became self-reinforcing. Any evidence that suggested complexity in the ancient Amazon was reinterpreted to fit the model, and researchers who questioned the orthodoxy found themselves marginalized, their careers stalling, their grant applications rejected. This wasn't conspiracy. This was just how academic paradigms work. Once a framework becomes dominant, especially one tied to a researcher as prominent as Meggers, challenging it becomes professionally dangerous. Meanwhile, the evidence that might have contradicted environmental determinism was literally rotting away. Because the Amazon had another trick that made skepticism easy. It erased its own history. In temperate climates, stone buildings last millennia. Ceramics survive in recognizable form for thousands of years. Metal artifacts corrode but remain identifiable. But in the Amazon, wood decays in decades. Thatch roofs disappear even faster. Earthen structures wash away in the torrential rains. Organic materials, plant fibers, woven textiles, anything made from jungle products, gone within a generation or two of abandonment. The Amazon is a forensic nightmare, a tropical graveyard that consumes evidence faster than archaeologists can excavate it. Trees grow through ancient plazas. Roots tear apart carefully constructed platforms. The humidity destroys anything remotely perishable. By the time professional archaeology came to the Amazon in the mid-20th century, centuries of jungle growth had already swallowed most traces of whatever had been there before. So when archaeologists went looking for the cities Carvajal described, they found very little, which reinforced the Megas model, which justified not looking very hard, which meant less funding for Amazon archaeology, which meant fewer discoveries, a perfect vicious cycle of confirmation bias. But there was something else going on too, something less scientific and more insidious, a deep cultural bias about what civilization actually looks like. The model most archaeologists were working from, consciously or not, was fundamentally European. Real civilizations built in stone. They had writing systems, they worked metal. They constructed monumental architecture that could impress and intimidate. They left behind artifacts that looked like artifacts, that could be displayed in museums and recognized immediately as products of complex societies. Amazonian cultures did none of these things. They built in wood and earth. They used perishable materials for everything. If they had record-keeping systems, they were probably based on textiles or other organic materials that didn't survive. Their monuments were earthworks, which just looked like oddly shaped hills covered in jungle. Their most impressive engineering was agricultural, manipulating soil and water systems in ways that left almost no visible trace once abandoned. By European standards, by the standards that dominated archaeology through most of the 20th century, Amazonian societies looked primitive, not because they were, but because they had adapted to their environment in ways that didn't produce the kind of evidence archaeologists knew how to recognize and interpret. They developed a civilization built on materials that time and climate erased, an invisible civilization that left behind mostly whispers and shadows. This created a perfect storm of denial. The environmental model said complex societies were impossible. The archaeological record seemed to confirm it by showing very little. And the cultural bias made researchers less likely to recognize evidence of complexity, even when they found it. The few researchers who pushed back, who suggested that maybe the Amazon's past was more interesting than Megas allowed, were dismissed as romantic or unscientific, as importing their own biases into interpretations that should remain objective. The irony is that the evidence was already accumulating, had been accumulating for decades, in museum collections, in scattered reports, in observations that didn't fit the model but were too fragmentary to overturn it, weird soils that shouldn't exist, earthworks that seemed too geometric to be natural, pottery traditions that were too sophisticated for supposedly simple societies, all of it explained away or ignored, until someone looked at the soil itself and realized it was screaming a truth nobody wanted to hear. The soil shouldn't exist. That's the first thing to understand about Terra Preta. In a region famous for having some of the worst agricultural soil on Earth, there are patches, thousands of them scattered across the Amazon basin, where the earth is black, rich, and so fertile that anything planted in it grows like it's been chemically enhanced. Except there are no chemicals, just soil. Soil that's been sitting there for centuries, sometimes over 1,000 years, getting more productive with age instead of less. Terra Preta do Indio, Amazonian dark earth. The locals had known about it forever. Farmers would seek out these dark patches specifically because crops grew better there. Certain areas just produced more, required less work, seemed almost magically abundant compared to the thin, exhausted soil surrounding them. But nobody had really asked the obvious question: why? What made these patches different? When soil scientists finally started analyzing Terra Preta systematically in the late 20th century, they found something that didn't make sense according to everything they knew about tropical soils. These weren't natural formations. They were absolutely, unmistakably human-made. The soil was loaded with charcoal, not from forest fires, but from controlled burning, bone fragments from fish and game animals, pottery shards, millions of them, ground down and mixed into the earth, organic waste of every description, and most remarkably, a thriving microbial ecosystem unlike anything found in normal Amazonian soil. Normal jungle soil in the Amazon is what podologists call oxysols, ancient, heavily weathered, stripped of most nutrients by millions of years of rainfall. The jungle looks lush because it's incredibly efficient at recycling, nutrients locked up in living biomass rather than stored in the ground. Kill the forest and you've got almost nothing to work with. This is why slash-and-burn agriculture in the Amazon exhausts land so quickly. The soil itself has almost nothing to give. But Terra Preta has more organic carbon than surrounding soils, often several times more. Higher pH, which is crucial because most Amazonian soils are acidly acidic. Vastly greater concentrations of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, everything you need for intensive agriculture. And it's stable. It doesn't wash away with the rains. It doesn't deplete after a few growing seasons. Plant something in Terra Preta, and the soil feeds it. Come back a year later and the soil is still rich. Come back a century later and it's still producing. The scale is what really breaks the model. We're not talking about a few garden plots. Terra Preta deposits have been identified across an estimated 10% of the Amazon basin. 10%, that's hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. Some individual sites contain deposits several meters deep covering dozens of hectares. The amount of human labor, the duration of occupation, the sheer number of people required to create soil deposits on this scale, it completely shatters the idea of small, scattered, nomadic groups barely surviving in the jungle. You don't create Terra Preta by accident. You can't make it quickly. These deposits represent generations, sometimes centuries of continuous occupation and deliberate soil management. People living in one place long enough to accumulate enormous quantities of organic waste. But not just dumping it randomly, engineering it. The charcoal in Terra Preta isn't just burnt wood, it's biochar. Charcoal produced under specific low oxygen conditions that give it a porous structure perfect for holding nutrients and hosting beneficial microorganisms. Modern agronomists are only now rediscovering what these ancient Amazonians apparently understood intimately. That charcoal, when properly prepared and mixed into soil with organic matter, creates a substrate that can sustain fertility almost indefinitely. They were amending soil at an industrial scale, taking the worst agricultural land in the world and transforming it into some of the best. This isn't something you stumble into. This is sophisticated knowledge, probably developed over thousands of years, refined through experimentation, passed down through generations. The kind of knowledge that requires stability, continuity, and probably specialized roles for people who understood soil chemistry, even if they wouldn't have called it that. And here's where it gets really strange. Terra Preta appears to be self-renewing. The microbial ecosystems in these soils are so robust, so well established, that they continue breaking down organic matter and maintaining fertility even centuries after human management stopped. Some researchers have documented Terra Preta deposits that seem to be growing at a rate of about 1 centimeter per year, not depleting, growing, as if the soil itself has been engineered to be alive, to actively maintain its own productivity. The mechanisms aren't fully understood. There's ongoing debate among microbiologists about exactly what's happening in Terra Preta at the microscopic level. Some think the biochar provides habitat for specific bacterial and fungal communities that form unusually stable symbiotic networks. Others focus on the pottery fragments, which might slowly release nutrients as they weather. Still others think there's something about the way nutrients bind to the charcoal matrix that makes them available to plants, while protecting them from being washed away by rain. What's clear is that whoever created Terra Preta understood something about soil ecology that modern science is still trying to fully grasp. They weren't just farming, they were engineering ecosystems, creating artificial soils designed to persist and produce for generations after their creators were gone. This is the signature of a sophisticated, settled agricultural civilization. Not people scratching out a marginal existence. People who had mastered their environment so completely they could remake it at the molecular level. Terra Preta became one of the first major cracks in the environmental determinism model. Because here was physical, measurable, undeniable evidence that contradicted everything Betty Meggers had argued. You can't create thousands of square kilometers of engineered soil with small, scattered nomadic populations. You can't develop and maintain the knowledge required for biochar production and soil amendment without stable communities and knowledge transmission across generations. You can't accumulate meter-deep deposits of human waste without dense populations living continuously in the same locations for centuries. The soil was proof, not of El Dorado's gold, but of something potentially more valuable. Evidence that the Amazon had supported complex, settled, technologically sophisticated societies. Societies that had solved the problem of tropical agriculture in ways that modern science hadn't even imagined. The jungle hadn't always been pristine wilderness. It had been honed, managed, modified, deliberately shaped by people who knew exactly what they were doing. And if the soil had been engineered on this scale, what else had they built that nobody was looking for? The answer, or at least the first glimpse of it, came from a place most maps leave blank. In the early 1990s, a young American archaeologist named Michael Heckenberger took a boat into the Upper Xingu region of Brazil, a maze of rivers and gallery forest in the southern Amazon. On paper, it was remote, thinly populated, almost empty. In reality, it was home to people who knew exactly what had once stood there. Heckenberger wasn't just wandering through the jungle with a shovel, he had an invitation. The Kwikuro, one of several indigenous groups of the Xingu, agreed to work with him. They already had names for places Western cartographers called uninhabited. They had stories about ancestors, about old towns, about roads that used to run straight as arrows through what is now tangled forest. For decades, anthropology in the Amazon had treated such stories as mythological, at best symbolic, pleasant echoes of a past that, according to the prevailing model, could never have been very large or complex. In the Xingu, Heckenberger did something very simple, and in its way, revolutionary. He listened. When Kwikuro elders pointed to a low-rise under the trees and said, "There was a village there," he didn't explain why that was unlikely. He went and checked. When they traced invisible roads with their hands, describing where they had once gone, he followed the directions with a compass. Slowly, carefully, he began to overlay indigenous memory onto topographic reality. And the forest started to resolve into a ghost city, not a city of stone. There were no pyramids glinting through the canopy, no carved temples waiting to be photographed. What emerged instead was a pattern in the earth itself: shallow ditches, raised berms, circular depressions where houses had once stood, straight, unnaturally straight, embankments cutting through the undergrowth like the faded lines of some buried blueprint. Digging and mapping over years, Heckenberger and his Kwikuro collaborators began to realize they weren't looking at isolated villages. They were standing inside a pre-Columbian urban landscape. At the heart of this landscape were large planned towns. Each one was organized around a central plaza, a broad, open space carefully oriented and geometrically precise. From the edges of these plazas radiated roads, wide, straight avenues, in some cases up to 40 meters across. Not narrow footpaths, highways carved through the forest, aligned with impressive regularity to the cardinal directions. Around the towns ran moats and defensive ditches, sometimes paired with earthen walls that would once have supported wooden palisades. These weren't improvised fortifications thrown up in a panic. Their shapes were deliberate, near-perfect circles, carefully measured arcs, repeated from site to site as if following a shared architectural grammar. Beyond the moats, arranged like satellites around a planet, were smaller settlements. Hamlets and villages spaced at consistent distances, linked back to the central town by those same straight roads. The pattern repeated across the region. Clusters of one major town and multiple attendant villages, forming what archaeologists call galactic settlement systems. Urban constellations, each with its own center of gravity. Scattered between them were what, at first glance, looked like random patches of useful trees. Peach palms, Brazil nuts, fruit-bearing species that do well near people. But the distribution wasn't random. These were managed orchards, agroforestry systems carefully placed near villages and along roads, providing food, materials, and shade. The forest itself had been coaxed into a garden. In the low-lying areas, where seasonal floods spread water across the plain, there were subtle earthworks, raised fields, fish weirs, channels guiding water into and out of ponds. What to a casual observer looked like wilderness swamp was, under close examination, a piece of hydraulic engineering. Fish farms, wetland gardens, carefully tuned to the rhythms of the rainy and dry seasons. It was a city, but not as the old world would define one. No towering walls of stone, no paved plazas shimmering in the sun. Instead, a civilization woven into living matter. Earth walls instead of brick, timber palisades instead of masonry ramparts, roads cut through forest instead of laid in cobblestone, water managed with ditches and embankments instead of aqueducts, orchards instead of colonnades, an urbanism of earth, wood, water, and plants. When Heckenberger's team began estimating population, the numbers quietly detonated centuries of assumption. Individual clusters in the Upper Xingu, one central town and its ring of villages, orchards, and engineered wetlands, may have supported tens of thousands of people, not spread thinly in tiny camps, but living in dense planned communities with clear streets, public spaces, and region-wide infrastructure. Zoom out from a single cluster, and the picture grows more astonishing. These nodes were themselves part of larger regional networks, the equivalent of small city-states or chiefdoms stitched together by roads, trade, and alliances. Across hundreds of kilometers, the Upper Xingu wasn't an untouched rainforest. It was a cultural mosaic, different groups, different languages, but sharing a common way of organizing land, water, and people. All of this had been there the whole time, hidden not by distance, but by expectation. The ditch around a town, filled in and softened by centuries of leaf fall, looks a lot like a natural depression unless you're looking for a circle. A road cut through forest, long since overgrown, sends only the faintest of signals, a linear rise, a subtle difference in soil, unless you have someone to tell you it was once a road. The Quikero did. Their oral histories spoke of great ancestral towns, of roads so straight you could walk them by starlight, of enemies defeated and alliances forged, of a time when the region was thick with people, when the forest was a tended fabric instead of a blank wall. For generations, Western scholars had treated these stories as exaggerations, legend embroidered onto a modest reality. The environment, it was assumed, simply could not support dense populations. The model said so. The soil said otherwise. And now the ground plans did too. When Heckenberger began publishing his findings in the early 2000s, the reaction in some quarters was skepticism bordering on disbelief. Planned towns, regional road systems, defensive moats and palisades in the Amazon. It sounded too much like El Dorado with the gold stripped out. But the data were methodical. Survey maps, radiocarbon dates, artifact distributions, statistical analyses of settlement spacing and orientation. Most importantly, the archaeological record and Quikero knowledge lined up. Places remembered as former centers turned out under excavation to be just that: large, long-occupied sites with deep cultural deposits. Old road lines corresponded to subtle linear earthworks still detectable beneath the trees. The geometry in the stories matched the geometry in the soil. Indigenous memory was not a colorful backdrop to real history. It was a source of it. This was the quiet revolution of the Upper Xingu discoveries. They didn't just add ruins to a map. They forced a philosophical shift in how we imagine civilization itself. For centuries, the mental image of an advanced society has been tied to stone. Temples, palaces, walls that refused to fall down. If there was no stone, the reasoning went, there could be no true city. Nothing large or organized enough to count. But here, in a corner of the Amazon, was a different template. Urbanism without masonry. Complexity without monuments that defy erosion. A landscape-scale design written in perishable materials and living systems. Earth ramparts that slump back into the ground. Wooden poles that rot. Orchards that merge seamlessly into wild forest once the gardeners are gone. From a certain perspective, it's more fragile than stone. From another, it's more sophisticated. These people didn't just build atop the forest. They built with it, folding human settlement into ecological processes so thoroughly that, when they disappeared, nature could reclaim the visible traces in a few generations. Only the subtle patterns remained, legible to those who remembered, or to those patient enough to ask. In the dark earth of Terra Preta and the buried geometry of the Upper Xingu, a new picture of Amazonian history began to emerge. Not of isolated bands clinging to the margins of an unforgiving environment, but of gardeners of a continent, engineers of soil, water, and forest. A civilization that chose living materials over stone, and for that very reason could almost vanish from sight. Almost. For a long time, that almost was enough. Even with Terra Preta underfoot and ghost cities mapped in the Xingu, it was still possible for skeptics to say, this is local. Interesting, yes, but exceptional. A curious pocket rather than a continent-wide phenomenon. What changed that wasn't another shovel in the ground. It was a laser in the sky. LIDAR, short for light detection and ranging, sounds like something out of science fiction, but the principle is simple. You send millions of laser pulses down from an aircraft. Each pulse hits something, leaf, branch, trunk, bare soil, and bounces back. By measuring how long that round trip takes, and doing it over and over again, you can build a three-dimensional picture of everything beneath the plane. Most of those pulses hit leaves. In a rainforest, they almost have to. But a small percentage, just enough, slip through the gaps. They reach the forest floor, bounce off, and return. With powerful computers, you can filter out the vegetation and keep only the last returns, the ones that touch the ground. Then, digitally, you peel away the canopy. What's left is the bare earth, as if the entire forest had been made of glass. You see things no satellite image, no low-flying airplane, no human eye from the forest floor could ever hope to notice. Gentle ridges become straight lines. Indistinct rises resolve into platforms. Random bumps fall into patterns. Geometry appears where before there had only been nature. In 2022, a team of researchers turned this technology on a region that, in theory, should have been unremarkable, the Llanos de Mojos in Bolivia. On a map, the Llanos look like a seasonally flooded savanna on the southwestern fringe of the Amazon, grasslands with scattered forest islands, crisscrossed by rivers that swell in the rains and retreat in the dry months. For decades, archaeologists knew there were pre-Columbian earthworks there. Mounds, causeways, bits of raised field systems. Interesting, but fragmentary. The kind of thing you can write off as small-scale local adaptation to a wet landscape. Then the LIDAR data came back. When the trees were stripped away digitally, the Llanos de Moals did not look like a marginal wetland. They looked like a kind of tropical urbanism that, until that point, nobody had seriously imagined. Across thousands of square kilometers, the bare Earth models revealed a lattice of human-made features. Long, straight causeways running arrow-like across the floodplain, networks of canals linking natural and artificial ponds, reservoirs with levees and spillways, engineered basins for holding and moving water, checkerboards of raised agricultural fields, subtle in profile but unmistakable in pattern, lifting crops above the wet season floods. And at the nodes of this network, something more dramatic: cities. These weren't the ghostly, low-relief traces of modest villages. They were monumental settlements attributed to what archaeologists call the Kasarabi culture, occupied roughly between 500 and 1400 CE. On the LIDAR images, the Kasarab sites stand out like islands of geometry. Massive, terraced platform mounds rise above the plain. Some support multiple levels, each one carefully cut and filled, like step pyramids made of earth. Conical pyramids, true pyramidal forms, up to 22 meters tall, crown their edges, towering over the surrounding savanna back when they were fresh and faced, likely with packed clay and vegetation. U-shaped structures open onto broad plazas, framing ceremonial or public spaces. The alignments are deliberate, the proportions repeated. This is not ad hoc piling of dirt. It is architecture, planned, standardized, and scaled up. The shock lies not just in the existence of one such center, but in their number and connections. LIDAR revealed pairs of large monumental sites, true urban hubs, surrounded by belts of smaller settlements, all tied together by causeways that run straight for kilometers. Some of these roads are 10 or 20 meters wide in their original form, built up above the floodplain, sometimes flanked by ditches. From the air, you can trace these lines like nerves running between organs. They link mound complexes to other mound complexes, to clusters of raised fields, to artificial ponds that may have functioned as fish farms or reservoirs. The entire landscape has been quietly re-engineered, its hydrology tuned and its topography modulated to support dense, permanent human life. This is not a city in the sense of 10-story stone buildings and crowded alleys. It's something more diffuse, what scholars call a low-density urban network. Population spread across a large area, but integrated by shared infrastructure, roads, canals, reservoirs, and fields, into a single socio-political system. In other parts of the world, we see echoes of this pattern. The sprawling water-managed landscapes around Angkor in Cambodia, the complex horticultural mosaics of the Maya lowlands. But in the Llanos de Moals, the scale and coherence of the Kasarabe earthworks suggest a form of tropical urbanism with very few clear analogues. It is a city that breathes with the flood cycle, the civilization built not by pushing the environment away but by choreographing it. And the LIDAR revolution didn't stop at Bolivia's borders. Once archaeologists saw what was possible, how much lay hidden beneath trees and grass, they began to look again at other parts of Amazonia. In Acre, in western Brazil, airborne laser scans illuminated hundreds of geometric earthworks, squares, circles, and interconnected enclosures etched into the ground, some spanning hundreds of meters across. From the air, they looked like sketches done with a compass and straight edge. These features, often called geoglyphs, had been glimpsed before where cattle ranching or logging had stripped away the forest. But LIDAR showed that the exposed ones were just the tip of a vast pattern extending under still intact canopy, silently preserving the outlines of ceremonial centers, gathering spaces, or fortified enclosures whose exact functions we can only infer. Elsewhere, in different corners of the basin, LIDAR passes have started to reveal more. linear mounds that may be longhouses and defensive ridges, hidden terraces, more raised fields and canal systems, entire settlement clusters that had escaped notice because, on the ground, they're swallowed by foliage and centuries of sediment. Every new survey seems to add dots to the map, but what's most striking is how thin the coverage still is. Only tiny fractions of the Amazon have been scanned with LIDAR. The areas that have been, by and large, are places with prior hints: known mounds, suspiciously regular forest islands, oral traditions of old towns. If that small biased sample already reveals hundreds of previously unknown sites, what lies beneath the millions of square kilometers nobody has yet flown a laser over? The honest answer is that we don't know. But the trend is hard to ignore. With each new dataset, the possibility that the Amazon was sparsely peopled wilderness before Europeans arrived grows less tenable. It begins to look, instead, like a heavily modified cultural landscape that, in the space of a few generations of disease and disruption, snapped back toward something that looks natural to colonial eyes. There is an intellectual jolt in seeing this written into the terrain. You look at the LIDAR images, the crisp angles, the repeating forms, and you realize that an entire chapter of human history has been hiding, not in some inaccessible desert or underwater ruin, but in the forest we thought we understood. There's an emotional undertow, too. For centuries, Amazonian indigenous peoples were told their ancestors had no cities, no large societies, no sophisticated engineering. Their stories of great towns and long roads were filed away as myth. Now, the ground itself, rendered in laser light, is quietly repeating those stories back. Yes, there were roads. Yes, there were monuments. Yes, this was once a peopled, organized, intentional world. And yet, outside of the glowing equations of LIDAR point clouds and the careful contour lines on archaeologists' maps, it remains almost invisible. Walk through the Llanos de Mojos today, or through a forest in acre under which a perfect square of ditches lies buried, and you might never suspect. The birds still call, the water still rises and falls, trees root in the crowns of old pyramids without knowing their crowns. The Amazon rewrites itself slowly, leaf by leaf. Now, with lasers and algorithms and the patient work of those who live there, we're finally beginning to read what was written before. The question that follows is simple and unsettling. If they could build all this, and if so much of it could almost vanish, what does that say about how they lived and how they disappeared? To understand how they disappeared, you have to understand what exactly was lost. Because this was not a world of empty jungle with a few villages clinging to riverbanks. It was a world engineered, carefully, patiently, by people who had learned to turn one of Earth's most difficult environments into a long green machine for producing food, fish, fibers, and stories. Start with the ground itself. Much of the Amazon, and especially places like the Llanos de Mojos, is either too wet or too dry at the wrong times. In the rains, water spills over riverbanks and spreads for kilometers. In the dry season, the same land can crack and bake. If you plant at the wrong elevation, your crops drown or wither. So they changed the elevation. Across floodplains from Bolivia to the central Amazon, archaeologists find the ghost outlines of raised fields, long, low ridges of earth lifted just a meter or two above their surroundings, but enough to matter. In cross-section, they look like the ribs of a giant buried under the savanna. In plan view, they resolve into grids and fans, aligned with old watercourses. On those platforms, people planted crops that liked their feet damp but not submerged. Maize, manioc, beans, squash. Between the ridges, shallow canals caught and held the floodwaters, creating micro-wetlands. The result was a kind of living staircase of moisture, from soggy trough to dry crown, each level suited to a different plant. In other areas, Where rivers meandered through the forest, they didn't carve out open fields as Europeans might have. Instead, they grew what some anthropologists call food forests. A food forest is not a plantation in neat rows. It's a layered mosaic where almost everything you see is useful, but it still looks to an untrained eye like wild jungle. You walk under the high crowns of Brazil nut trees, towering above all else, their nuts dropping in heavy pods that can feed families and attract game animals. Between them stand cacao trees with their ridged pods, acai palms with fruit-heavy bunches, peach palms with oily, protein-rich drupes. Below that, shrubs, vines, and herbs, medicinal plants, edible leaves, spices, fibers for weaving. On the ground, patches of manioc or sweet potatoes occupy the gaps where light touches the soil. This was not an accidental arrangement. Over generations, people carried seeds and seedlings along rivers and trails, planting and protecting what they valued, weeding out what they didn't. They grafted, transplanted, burned selectively. The forest responded. Modern botanical surveys show that in many parts of the Amazon, economically useful species are far more common near present and former indigenous settlements than you'd expect by chance. The distribution patterns form halos around old habitation mounds and river bluffs. Even today, centuries after depopulation, the forest still remembers where people once lived, in its very species composition. And then there was water. To a casual visitor, a flooded savanna looks like chaos. Rivers that forget their banks, seasonal ponds that appear and vanish, ground that alternates between bog and dust. To the engineers of the Kasarabi and their neighbors, it was infrastructure waiting to be tuned. From the air, you can trace canals running in long, deliberate lines across what looks like flat land. Some go on for tens, even hundreds of kilometers, linking natural streams to artificial ponds. Others parallel causeways, turning a road into a levee into a dam. In the rains, these channels helped spread water out, slowing and storing it, reducing the violence of floods. In the dry months, they concentrated and redirected it toward ponds and low basins that could hold water long after the rivers fell. Those ponds were not just reservoirs. Many show signs of having been shaped and reinforced, their banks built up, their inlets and outlets controlled. In them, people likely practiced aquaculture, managing fish populations the way a pastoralist manages herds. Ethnographic accounts from historic Amazonia describe fish weirs made of stakes and woven fences, guiding fish into traps as water levels drop. Stone is scarce here, but wood is everywhere. And in the archaeology, you see the negative of that technology: lines of post holes, low earthen embankments, subtle V-shapes in the floodplain. Fish driven into temporary ponds, scooped up in baskets, smoked and stored for when times were lean. Fire was part of the system too. Not the runaway burning of deforestation, but patchy, intentional burns in the drier months. People would set fire to areas of savanna or open forest to clear undergrowth, encourage fresh grass for game, and maintain open travel corridors between tree islands. Over time, this managed mosaic created a mix of habitats, forest, woodland, grassland, that supported a diversity of plants and animals far beyond what a uniform, untouched canopy would. From above, if you could see centuries at once, the landscape would flicker. Fields rising and falling, forest islands expanding and shrinking, canals and ponds opening and silting in, all guided by a memory of where water would go and what would grow where. Inside this engineered environment, people organize themselves. What the LIDAR and ground surveys show is not a random scattering of villages, it's a hierarchy. Large centers with monumental earthworks, platform mounds, plazas, pyramids, anchor regions. Around them radiate smaller sites, secondary centers, then hamlets, then individual farmsteads and fishing camps. The big nodes, places like the Kasarabi cities in Mojos, or the mound complexes on Marajo Island at the Amazon's mouth, seem to have served as ceremonial and political hubs. Their plazas could host gatherings measured in hundreds or thousands of people. Their raised causeways connected them to satellite communities, making movement possible even when the plains were under a meter of water. This pattern suggests some form of regional confederacies, clusters of allied communities bound by shared rituals, trade, and likely kinship. Leadership structures are hard to reconstruct without written records, but the investment in earthworks implies coordination. Labor organized over seasons, if not generations. Some mounds seem to be elite residences, others temples or ritual platforms, others burial places. Status, in other words, was mapped onto the landscape itself. Trade knit these regions together over longer distances. The Amazon's rivers are natural highways, and archaeological finds showed goods moving along them. Exotic stones, marine shells far inland, pigments, feathers, crafted objects. Some ceramics appear in styles far from their points of origin, suggesting either traveling artisans or the exchange of finished wares between distant groups. The pottery, where it survives, is a quiet rebuttal to the idea that these were simple societies. On Marajo, the so-called Marajoara culture left behind ceramics that are almost bewildering in their intricacy. Vessels covered in tightly coiled scrollwork, stylized human and animal figures, complex geometric patterns that wrap around bowls and urns in continuous bands. Some pieces are painted, others incised, others modeled in relief. Many come from burial contexts, hinting at a rich ritual life, ancestors honored with offerings that took skill and time to produce. Elsewhere, the art took different forms. In Acre and neighboring regions, the great geoglyphs, perfect circles, squares, and interconnected enclosures, suggest spaces set aside for special purposes. Their walls are too low to be serious fortifications. Many show no evidence of domestic debris. They may have been ceremonial grounds, gathering places for feasts, rituals, or negotiations between groups. Imagine walking along a forest path that suddenly opens into a vast cleared circle, its earthen walls rising above you, the sky framed in a geometry you rarely see in nature. Drums, chants, painted bodies, processions along causeways that align with solstices or river bends. We don't know the details, but the labor invested in these forms means they mattered. And through it all, one striking absence: stone. There is almost no workable building stone in most of lowland Amazonia. No granite quarries, no limestone cliffs to carve, no handy blocks to stack into pyramids or walls. If you want to build here, you build with what you have: earth, wood, fiber, thatch. Houses were raised on wooden posts, their walls woven from palm ribs and daubed with clay, their roofs thatched with palm leaves. Bridges were timber and vine. Palisades, where they existed, were rows of sharpened stakes. Even tools that might elsewhere be stone, hoes, digging sticks, could be made of hardwood, bone, or shell. From a preservation standpoint, this is a disaster. Wood rots, thatch decays, soil slumps. In a few centuries, a great hall collapses into a low, ambiguous rise. A palisade becomes a stained line in the subsoil. A city of 10,000 becomes a slightly drier patch of forest, resting on an artificial hill. From an engineering standpoint, though, it was sophisticated adaptation. Earth is abundant and easy to move in a wet landscape. Wood renews itself. Flexible structures bend in storms. If a house floods, you can raise the floor. If a canal silts up, you can cut a new one a few meters away. This system is not a monument in stone. It is a choreography of soil and water and plants. When you add it all up, the raised fields and food forests, the canal lattices and fish ponds, the geoglyphs and mound cities, the confederacies and trade routes, you get something that no chronicle from the conquest ever quite captured. 1 million people, maybe more, living in a landscape that looks, at first glance, like wilderness, but is in fact a vast, living artifact. A civilization whose main building materials were biodegradable, whose walls photosynthesized, whose streets floated in the flood season. That's why it could vanish so completely. Not because it was fragile or unsophisticated, but because it was so deeply entangled with the forest that, when its people were gone, the system they had shaped could keep on growing, slowly absorbing the traces of their presence, until almost nothing obvious remained. To see how that happened, and how quickly, we have to turn to the moment when an entirely different kind of world crashed into theirs. The first Europeans to push their way into the fringes of this engineered forest world had no idea what they were walking into. To them, the Amazon was a green wall at the edge of maps, a place of rumors, gold, cannibals, rivers that ran backward, monsters in the trees. They came in the early 1500s, not as careful observers, but as extensions of empires that were already in motion. Spain pushing west from the Caribbean and Andes, Portugal feeling its way along the Atlantic coast. On paper, the timeline is simple. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas drew an imaginary line down a map of the Atlantic, splitting the unknown lands of the New World between Spain and Portugal. In reality, no one knew exactly what lay beyond the coasts. Over the next 50 years, that ignorance collided with one of the most delicate human ecologies on Earth. Francisco de Orellana's voyage in 1541 to 1542 is often taken as the first full European descent of the Amazon. He started in the Andes with an expedition led by Gonzalo Pizarro, wandered east in search of cinnamon and riches, and eventually drifted downriver on a desperate, starving gamble. His men were half mad by the time they reached the Atlantic. But what he reported seeing along the way did not look like an empty jungle. He described settlements, cultivated fields, and stretches of riverbank that seemed continuously inhabited for days at a time. He claimed there were powerful polities along the water, women warriors, fleets of canoes. Later writers would dismiss much of this as fantasy, but even stripped of exaggeration, his account points to something crucial. In the early contact years, this was a crowded world, and then, in the space of a few generations, it wasn't. The usual story blames conquest, steel, guns, massacres. Those things happened, brutally, in Caribbean islands and Andean kingdoms. But in most of lowland Amazonia, a more profound destroyer never raised a sword. It traveled in breath, in skin, in droplets on the ragged edge of a cloak. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, perhaps plague, a cluster of old-world pathogens that had co-evolved for millennia in dense Eurasian and African populations. People living alongside cattle, pigs, horses, chickens, with cities as petri dishes. Amazonian societies had none of that history. No herds of large domestic animals, no ancient record of epidemics. Their immune systems were tuned to their own parasites and infections, not to the disease package Europe was about to export. When the two worlds met, even indirectly, biology took over. You don't actually need conquering armies to get an epidemiological catastrophe. All you need is contact with someone who's had contact with someone who's had contact. A sailor trades knives and cloth to coastal communities. Those communities pass the goods and the viruses upriver along their existing trade routes, because there were trade routes, dense ones, the same networks that once moved shells and pigments and stories between floodplain towns now carried something else. A single infected person with smallpox can shed virus for days before breaking out in recognizable lesions. By the time anyone knows they're sick, they've already shared meals, rituals, embraces. They've already traveled. So a disease like smallpox doesn't move at the speed of a marching column. It moves at the speed of rumor, of canoe travel, of market gatherings. It races ahead of written history. The result is almost impossible to grasp in human terms. Archaeologists and historical demographers, piecing together fragments of documentary evidence and population models, suspect that across the Americas as a whole, somewhere between 80 and 95% of people died within the first century and a half after 1492. Some scholars argue for repeated waves that drove mortality in particular regions even higher. The Amazon was not spared. It simply had fewer chroniclers watching. We get glimpses. Jesuit letters from the 1600s and 1700s mention villages reduced from hundreds of people to a few survivors in a single season. Reports of pestilences that leave whole river stretches nearly empty. Accounts of priests arriving to find fields abandoned, houses collapsing, elders remembering that this was once a place of many fires. The pattern is chilling. First contact on a given river might be a trading visit, a skirmish, or the brief anchoring of a ship offshore. Within a few years, often before any European returns, the first epidemic hits. People with no inherited resistance fall sick all at once. Leaders die. Shamans die. The knowledge of when to burn fields, where to cut new canals, how to call fish into weirs begins to fray. Communities recluster for safety or scatter into the forest to escape. Flight spreads disease further. Sister villages that once exchanged marriage partners now exchange contagion. By the time the second or third wave of disease arrives, measles following smallpox, influenza following measles, there are fewer people left to tend crops, fewer to nurse the sick. A civilization can survive a bad harvest, a flood, even a war. It cannot easily survive losing 9 out of 10 people, not once, but again and again. Imagine a regional center in the Upper Xingu, one of those earthwork-linked clusters that Heckenberger would later map under the canopy. At its height, it might have drawn in thousands during rituals, maintained causeways and canals through organized labor, managed food forests whose productivity depended on constant human attention. Now strip away almost everyone. The plaza's empty. The earthworks are still there, but the crews to maintain them are gone. Young survivors flee to relatives in distant villages, or are captured and relocated by slaving expeditions feeding Portuguese frontiers. Trade breaks down. A causeway that once buzzed with traffic becomes just another line of slightly higher ground, slowly shaded over by pioneer trees. When later European expeditions came paddling through these same waters, sometimes only a few decades after the first rooms of contact, they saw something very different from what Orellana had seen. Instead of a near-continuous string of settlements, they saw long stretches of apparently untouched forest, broken by occasional shrunken communities. Where their predecessors had reported large towns, they found a few hamlets hugging riverbanks. The raised fields were already sinking back into the floodplain matrix. The food forests, still rich, now looked to outsiders like wild abundance rather than cultivated legacy. From the vantage point of those later travelers, the Amazon really did look like a great green wilderness dotted with primitive villages. They assumed this was how it had always been. They wrote as much, and their descriptions fed into European philosophers about natural man, about empty lands waiting to be used. The catastrophe had created an illusion. Ecologically, though, the impact of that great dying was anything but invisible. People had been holding open clearings, burning savannas, pruning and harvesting in ways that kept parts of the landscape in an early successional state. Fields, gardens, and managed mosaics lock up carbon in crops and soil, but a mature forest locks up far more, especially when it's expanding into recently abandoned land. As millions of hectares of Amazonian farmland, orchards, and settlement zones were left untended, Secondary forest began to regrow over them. Young trees grew fast, pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it in wood and soil. Over decades and centuries, that regrowth added up. Climate scientists and historical ecologists have started to wonder whether this sudden reforestation across the Americas, not just in the Amazon, was large enough to leave a fingerprint on the global climate. Some studies suggest that the cooling trend known as the Little Ice Age, which gripped parts of the Northern Hemisphere between roughly the 1500s and 1800s, may have been nudged, in part, by the sequestration of carbon in these newly regrown forests. If that's true, then the death of perhaps 50 million people across the Americas subtly dimmed the global thermostat. The absence of their fires, their crops, their breathing bodies helped make European winters a little harsher, advanced glaciers a little farther, shifted weather patterns in ways no one at the time could trace. The Great Dying was not just a human tragedy. It was a planetary event, and yet, for all its scale, it left so few obvious scars in the Amazonian ground. That's the other part of the illusion. Stone cities crumble into ruins that shout their presence for millennia. Earth and wood, once overgrown, whisper. To European eyes trained on castles and cathedrals, there was nothing here that looked like civilization after the people were gone. Diseases explain the breathtaking speed of depopulation. They explain how a million-strong, finely tuned human system could unravel in a few lifetimes. But they don't fully explain why the jungle seemed to erase almost every visible trace of what had been built. For that, you have to look not at what destroyed this world, but at how perfectly its creators had stitched themselves into the forest from the beginning, and at the quiet efficiency with which nature covers its tracks when left alone. The first thing to understand is that the Amazon is not kind to memories made of flesh and fiber. In temperate climates, an abandoned wooden house might linger for a century or more, sagging slowly, boards silvering in the sun, roof collapsing in stages. In the tropics, that process is put on fast forward. Heat, humidity, insects, fungi, bacteria, all of them are working full-time. A fallen tree can be soft enough to push your hand through in just a few rainy seasons. Thatch roofs rot and cave in within years if they are not constantly repaired. Posts sink, mold, and are eaten from the inside. Even massive hardwood beams, if left untended, are quickly colonized by termites and carpenter ants, turned into intricate dust. Within a generation of abandonment, a large timber house can vanish into the soil so completely that, to an untrained eye, there's nothing left but a slightly raised patch of darker earth and a different mix of weeds. Now scale that up. Imagine long streets of palm thatch houses lining a plaza, storage buildings, ritual structures, raised walkways, wooden palisades, canoe docks, fish traps woven from flexible branches, all of it dependent on continuous human work, rethatching, resetting posts, patching walls, retying lashings. Remove the people and the jungle starts the clock. Termites move in, mold blooms, vines find purchase. First, roofs fall, then walls slouch. Then, in one storm or two, the last recognizable outlines give way. By the time 100 years have passed, a single, long human memory, most of the organic architecture is gone. What remains is subtle, stains in the soil, patterns of post holes, occasional burned patches where hearths once were. The Amazon is, in that sense, an antique Egypt. It does not build monuments out of stone and dry air. It recycles. But the Amazon doesn't just erase structures. It also eats absence. When people cleared patches of forest for towns, gardens, and fields, they were constantly fighting what ecologists call succession, the natural tendency of vegetation to move from open ground to dense forest over time. You slash and burn, you plant, you weed, you maintain. Stop doing that, and the system runs in reverse. First come the fast colonizers, grasses, herbs, shrubs, then fast-growing pioneer trees, Cecropia, for example, with their pale trunks and big hand-shaped leaves, shoot up like rockets. They love light and open space. They knit together overhead, creating a new canopy within a couple of decades. Under their shade, slower, shade-tolerant species germinate. Palms, hardwoods, fruiting trees already present in nearby forest. Birds and monkeys bring seeds. Rodents bury nuts. The soil, enriched by centuries of human activity, gives them a head start. Give that process 100, 200 years, and you get something that looks, to most observers, like virgin rainforest. Tall trees, layered canopy, vines, epiphytes, birdsong, the sound of insects, except in tiny clues, a straight line of unusually even-aged trees, a mound too regular to be random, a strip of Terra Preta richer and blacker than the surrounding soil. The ghost of a former plaza or field lingers. To the people who had lived there, those clues would have been obvious. They would have remembered the stories. They would have known that the cluster of Brazil nut trees was the remnant of a planting, that the dark soil marked an old village. But after the epidemics, the people who carried those memories were precisely the ones most likely to be lost. Survivors did not simply stay put, waiting for the next wave of disease or the next slaving party to arrive. In many parts of the Amazon, they broke apart. Large, nucleated settlements that had once been safe, fortified, surrounded by allies, endowed with prestige, suddenly became dangerous places to be. They were too visible, too easy to find from the river, too obvious as targets for raiders and colonists. So families and fragments of communities did what they had always done in times of trouble, but now on a much larger scale. They moved. Some retreated up smaller tributaries, away from the wide, traffic-heavy main channels that had been the arteries of their world and were now highways for strangers. Others went overland, following game trails, slipping into interfluvial zones, the lands between major rivers, where access was harder and outsiders rarely ventured. They shifted toward mobility, toward smaller, more dispersed settlements. Gardens became lighter on the land. Structures were built with the expectation of flight. Storied plazas gave way to temporary camps, seasonal hamlets, flexible arrangements that could be abandoned at short notice. This was not a return to some primordial hunter-gatherer state so much as an adaptation to a new, hostile political ecology. People remembered the old centers, the ancestral earthworks, the orchards now swallowed by taller forest. Some groups continued to visit them in ritual or in secret, or to harvest fruit from trees their grandparents had tended. But they no longer invested in maintaining the overt, large-scale landscape modifications that had once made their world so visible. To European eyes dropping in centuries later, this shift in lifeways looked like evidence that complex societies had never existed here at all. They met smaller, more mobile groups and assumed that this was how things had always been. That assumption wasn't just an innocent misunderstanding. It was convenient. Colonial regimes in Portugal and Spain were not especially interested in discovering that the lands they were claiming were full of people with long histories of sophisticated land management. The legal and moral frameworks of the time, doctrines about vacant lands, about civilized versus savage peoples, worked best if the Amazon could be portrayed as a nearly empty wilderness, barely touched by human hands. Travelers who did hint at former abundance, who mentioned abandoned clearings, old roads, or rumors of once great centers in the interior, were easy to dismiss. Their accounts could be filed under exaggeration, misinterpretation, or myth. The jungle itself cooperated, covering up the very features that might have supported their stories. Over time, this became self-reinforcing. Early chroniclers who spoke of large riverine populations were labeled unreliable, so later scholars leaned more heavily on those who described emptiness. Those later accounts, in turn, shaped academic expectations. Archaeologists trained in Old World sites, in places where civilization meant stone walls and monumental sculpture, looked at the Amazon and saw little that fit their mental templates. Environmental assumptions filled in the rest. The idea that tropical soils were too poor to support sustained agriculture, that the climate was too harsh for dense populations, that the apparent abundance of the forest was natural rather than curated. Meanwhile, under the canopy, organic architecture decomposed, clearing edges blurred, and secondary growth matured into something that looked indistinguishable from primary forest. The more time passed, the more complete the illusion became. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, the orthodox view was firmly in place. The Amazon was a green void. Its indigenous inhabitants were scattered, living in small, simple societies that had always existed at low density, constrained by environment. Any suggestion to the contrary was treated as romantic fantasy or nationalist boosterism. So you end up with a peculiar convergence. Natural decomposition stripped away the obvious physical traces of cities without stone. Forest regrowth masked human fingerprints under a seamless green surface. Epidemics fragmented societies and pushed survivors into forms of life that left fewer archaeological scars. Colonial narratives preferred an empty wilderness. Academic models, shaped by those narratives and by what they could see on the ground, reinforced the emptiness. Each layer by itself might have been partial, questionable, open to challenge. Together they formed something that looked like certainty. 1 million people, maybe more, could vanish not because they were never there, but because every system, biological, political, intellectual, was aligned to forget them. Only when those systems begin to be questioned, when satellite sensors start to read through foliage, when soil scientists dig into seemingly ordinary ground, when indigenous historians insist that their oral traditions remember things the written record ignored, does the outline of what was lost start to emerge again. And in that outline, another mystery appears. Because even as the forest closed over abandoned towns, not everything sank beneath the leaves. Some traces were never meant to be hidden. Some were carved so deeply into earth and spirit that even the jungle couldn't quite erase them. They're not easy to see from the ground. Stand next to one and you might notice a strange ditch, a bank a little too regular, a curve that feels designed rather than accidental. You might walk along it for a while, brush past grasses, step over termite mounds, hear insects rasping in the heat, and then, suddenly, the line disappears into scrub and pasture and it's gone. But pull back. Rise 100, 200 meters into the air, and the pattern snaps into focus. In the western Amazon, especially in the Brazilian state of Acre, deforestation did something that centuries of exploration had failed to do. It peeled back the canopy and revealed geometry. Perfect circles, almost perfect squares, long straight ditches connecting them like lines on some enormous board. Enclosures the size of several football fields, their earthen walls and trenches describing shapes so precise that surveyors still measure their angles and radii with a kind of quiet disbelief. Hundreds of these geoglyphs have now been documented, etched into the gently rolling clay soils of interfluvial uplands that were, until recently, written off as marginal and remote. Some are solitary, isolated shapes. Others are part of clusters, concentric circles, overlapping squares, diamonds nested inside circles, all linked by straight causeways that run arrow true for hundreds of meters. If you mapped them all out on a blank sheet of paper, with no forest, no rivers, no modern roads, you might assume you were looking at a planned landscape, a system, not random work scattered through wilderness, but pieces of a larger design. That in itself raises questions. But the real mystery begins when you walk into them with a trowel and a notebook. For all their scale, these are not towns in the familiar sense. Excavations along the ditches and embankments turn up pottery, hearths, post holes, bits of charcoal, traces of wooden palisades or fences, enough to say that people were definitely here, working, gathering, maintaining. But what you don't see, or see only faintly, are the dense, continuous layers of trash and building debris that mark permanent year-round habitation, the deep midden deposits, the packed floors resurfaced again and again, the rebuilding of house over house over house that you find in known village sites. Many of the geoglyphs look, archaeologically, like places that were visited repeatedly, maybe over centuries but not occupied full-time. The earthworks themselves required enormous labor, digging out ditches several meters wide and deep, throwing up the spoil into banks, keeping those lines clean and sharp over generations. That's not something you do on a whim and abandon. So if these were not cities of houses, what were they? No one can say with certainty. That's part of the allure. But the absence of dense domestic remains pushes researchers toward other possibilities. One is that these were ceremonial centers. The regularity of the shapes, the care taken to align ditches and entrances, the way some enclosures are paired or nested suggest pattern and meaning. A squared enclosure oriented along a particular axis, a circular one adjacent, its entrance facing a specific direction, paths connecting them like arteries. Another line of thought points upward to the sky. In other parts of the world, large geometric earthworks have turned out to have astronomical or calendrical functions, alignments with solstices and equinoxes, with the rising points of particular stars, with the movement of the sun across the horizon at key times of year. Some researchers have begun testing similar ideas here, looking at how entrances line up with solar events, how certain axes might track seasonal changes. The results so far are suggestive but not conclusive. A few entrances do seem to face sunrise or sunset at solstice, others don't. It's entirely possible that multiple logics were in play at once, cosmological, social, territorial, layered in ways we no longer fully grasp. A third possibility, which doesn't exclude the others, is that these were gathering places. Imagine you're part of a network of community scattered across a wide region, living along small streams and low ridges, in villages that come and go as gardens are exhausted and soils recover. Most of the year, you're busy with local concerns, planting, fishing, hunting, raising children, managing alliances and quarrels with the neighboring hamlet. But once or twice a year, at the onset of the rains, or at the time when a particular fruit ripens, or when a certain constellation first appears over the horizon, people begin to move. Canoes come down the creeks. Footpaths, usually quiet, fill with travelers. Extended families converge on a place everyone knows, a circle in the earth, a square connected by straight ceremonial roads, a place that is not just somewhere in the forest, but the center of a story, the pivot of a calendar. For a few days or weeks, the geoglyph becomes something utterly different from the quiet pasture or scrubland it is today. Fires burn along the embankments. Songs are sung in languages and dialects you don't normally hear. Marriages are arranged, disputes settled, alliances renewed. Goods travel, ceramic styles, feathers, resins, salt, news. Then, as quickly as it filled, the place empties again. People disperse back to their home territories. The ditch and bank remain, holding the memory of those gatherings in their geometry. In that sense, the geoglyphs might have been physical anchors for a social world largely built out of movement and relationship. Pilgrimage sites, if you like, though the word carries a lot of baggage from other continents. At the very least, nodal points where dispersed populations could briefly become a single people. If that sounds speculative, it is. We're trying to reconstruct intention from soil stains and the occasional potsherd. But here, Amazonian cosmology, what we can glimpse of it from peoples who survived the apocalypse, offers some guidance. Across many indigenous traditions in the region, the forest is not a backdrop. It is an inhabited, intentional universe. Rivers are not just waterways. They're persons, ancestors, or paths carved by spirit beings. Certain hills and bluffs are places where the land woke up, or where mythic events took place. Animals are often people in another form, with villages and societies of their own, interacting with humans through hunting, dreams, and ritual. The world in this view is layered. There is the everyday forest you walk through, and then there are its other dimensions, the underworld of river bottoms and burrowing creatures, the sky world of birds and thunder beings, the interior worlds inside mountains or large trees. Shamans and ritual specialists move between these layers. Ordinary people do so too, but mostly at marked times and places under guidance. Landscapes in such a system are not neutral. A clearing, a bend in the river, a certain stand of trees might be a door, a place where the boundaries between layers are thinner. It makes sense, then, that people would inscribe those places, cut ditches, raise banks, mark lines, for reasons that were as spiritual as they were social. When archaeologists talk about the geoglyphs as ceremonial or cosmological, they're trying to find a word for this entanglement. A circle might diagram a myth. A square might represent the ordering of space into cardinal directions. A straight causeway might be a replica of a path taken by powerful beings at the beginning of time. Or it might be all of those things at once, plus something we haven't yet imagined. The tragedy is that when a civilization like this collapses, not in a single blaze, but in waves of disease and dislocation, you don't just lose the people and their buildings. You lose entire systems of understanding. You lose the stories that told you why a particular geoglyph had to face that way, why the entrances were where they were, why you walked clockwise and not counterclockwise on certain days. You lose the songs that encoded star paths, the taboos that governed when you could enter a sacred enclosure, the metaphors that link to ditch and acre to a constellation overhead, and to the intestines of a mythic anaconda. You also lose technologies that don't look like technologies to us, ways of reading the forest as text, of diagnosing illness as imbalance between worlds, of using plants not just as medicine, but as interlocutors. You lose a vocabulary for talking about rivers as relatives rather than resources, and yet, not everything vanished. Some Amazonian peoples who survived, often by retreating into marginal zones, still carry oral traditions that hint at older, larger worlds. There are stories of great assemblies held in houses that encompass entire communities, where multiple peoples once gathered under a single roof. Accounts of ancient roads, straight and wide, that connected distant territories. Myths in which ancestors carved lines into the earth to mark agreements with other beings, or to fix the course of rivers. Ethnographers working with groups in the Upper Xingu, in western Amazonia, and along the Rio Negro sometimes hear echoes that resonate uncannily with what the LIDAR and the shovel are now revealing. Memories of abandoned plazas in the old days, of sacred mounds that must not be disturbed, of places of the elders far off in the forest that only initiated people may visit. We have to be careful here. It's easy and dangerous to treat living cultures as mere fossil repositories, or to cherry-pick stories that fit our maps. Traditions change, new meanings accrete. Old sites can be reinterpreted many times. But when oral histories talk about large gatherings in cleared places, about roads that run straighter than any animal trail, about ancestral structures now hidden by forest, it's hard not to see at least the possibility of continuity. Faint reflections of a time when enormous geometric enclosures in places like Acre were not mysterious patterns glimpsed from satellite images, but familiar landmarks in a lived sacred geography. For now, we stand at a strange intersection. High-tech sensors show us circles and squares carved into old soils. Excavations give us fragments of pottery and charcoal. Living elders share stories of powerful places in the forest. Between them is a gap of language, of lost context, of 6 centuries of disruption. Into that gap we can project ruin or wonder. We can see the geoglyphs as mute remnants of a vanished people, or as the surviving bones of a spiritual landscape that still, in some quiet way, remembers itself. For a long time, almost everything about this story was framed around a single powerful image: the Amazon as untouched wilderness, an endless green sea, primeval, pure, a place where nature, finally free from human hands, could be itself. If you grew up with school maps and nature documentaries, that picture probably lives somewhere in your head. The Amazon as the opposite of history, the last refuge from us. But the more we look, the less that picture holds. Charcoal buried meters deep in the soil, pollen grains showing centuries of controlled burning and regrowth, orchards of useful trees, Brazil nuts, cacao, palms, clustered around ancient sites in ways that look far more like long-term gardening than random chance. Terra Preta soils appearing not as scattered curiosities, but as part of vast, patterned landscapes of enrichment. All of it points to the same unsettling conclusion. The forest we see today is not simply what happens when you leave land alone. It is, in part, what happens when millions of people manage and inhabit a region for thousands of years, and then vanish, leaving the system they built to keep running on its own. In that sense, the natural Amazon is already a cultural artifact, a kind of living ruin. That doesn't mean the forest is artificial in the way a city park is artificial. It means human influence and ecological process have been woven together so tightly for so long that it's hard to pull them apart. Certain tree species are far more common near ancient settlements than in supposedly wild control areas. Fish populations cluster around old weirs and managed lakes. Game animals follow patterns set by long-abandoned gardens and fallows. What looks like spontaneous abundance often turns out to be inheritance. This is where the story stops being only about the past and becomes uncomfortably present. Because how we imagine the Amazon, empty or inhabited, pristine or worked, shapes what people feel entitled to do with it. If you convince yourself that a landscape has no real history, no long-standing human claims, then it becomes easier to see it as open, available, a blank page for whatever project comes next. Cattle pasture, soybean fields, gold mines, hydroelectric reservoirs. For centuries, that's exactly how powerful outsiders have written about the region. From early colonial officials to modern agribusiness lobbyists, the argument repeats in different accents. The forest is unused. The people living there are backward or few. The land is empty enough to be improved. Acknowledging that this was once a densely peopled, carefully engineered world cuts directly across that story. If the Upper Xingu supported complex networks of towns and roads without destroying its soils, if vast areas of western Amazonia were transformed into dark, fertile ground by long-term, low-intensity management, if the forest mosaic itself bears the imprint of indigenous choice, then it's harder to claim that the only route to development is clearing and burning. It also makes the ethical stakes more obvious. When bulldozers push into virgin forest and chainsaws open new fronts, they may be cutting not just into ecosystems, but into cemeteries, sacred sites, and the last fragile traces of societies that have already endured one apocalypse. Here the irony sharpens. Many of the most spectacular new discoveries, geoglyphs, earthwork villages, ancient causeways, are coming to light precisely because the forest that covered them is being removed. Lesser can peer through canopy, but first roads must be cut, clearings opened, airstrips built. Archaeologists are racing to survey areas ahead of the advancing front of deforestation. In satellite images, the pattern is almost painful. A square of new pasture appears, bright against the darker green. Along its edges, faint shapes emerge. A circle in the raw soil, a straight line where a geoglyph ditch has been sliced open. The ghost of a plaza in the way the forest regrew slightly differently over an old settlement. By the time those photos analyze, the site may already be plowed, fenced, and seeded with grass. We are, in some regions, discovering the civilization at the exact moment we erase the last of its physical traces. Against that backdrop, the work still underway takes on a certain urgency. New LIDAR surveys are being planned not just in Acre or the Upper Xingu, but across large swathes of the basin, in Bolivia's Llanos de Moxos, along the Madeira and Tapajos, in the headwaters of the Negro and Japura. Each pass of the laser reveals yet more: raised fields, fish weirs, rectilinear mounds, causeways crossing seasonally flooded plains. At the same time, geneticists are teasing out ancient population movements from the DNA of living peoples and rare ancient remains. They're finding signatures of old expansions and contractions, hints of contact between distant regions, traces of now-vanished groups who contributed to the genetic tapestry and then disappeared as distinct communities. Linguists map family trees of languages, looking for branching points that might correspond to migrations or the rise and fall of regional centers. Sometimes a word for a particular crop or a specific kind of earthwork travels across unrelated tongues like a fossil clue, and quietly, often away from headlines, indigenous historians, elders, and researchers are working with archaeologists to weave oral memory into these reconstructions. A story about an ancestral migration upriver might line up with a trail of ancient sites, a traditional name for a hill, place of the old people, where the great house stood, might alert a survey team to look more closely. A myth about earth-cutting beings could, without meaning to, preserve a symbolic echo of ditch-making centuries ago. None of this is simple. Oral traditions change, scientific models are provisional, but when different lines of evidence begin to point in similar directions, a hazy picture gains focus. Still, beneath the growing detail, something humbling remains. A civilization that may have counted its people in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps 1 million or more, can all but vanish into regenerated forest in a matter of centuries. Roads melt back into ridges, plazas fill with trees, embankments slump, then hide beneath roots and leaf litter. Written records where they existed rot. Viruses and bacteria do their quiet work. From the vantage point of deep time, even very large human projects are surprisingly fragile. That doesn't make them meaningless. It does complicate our sense of permanence. If a continent-scale engineered landscape can so thoroughly return to green that generations of scientists mistake it for untouched wilderness, what does that say about our own cities of glass and concrete, our highways and dams and grids, about the infrastructures we assume will define an era? Perhaps they will endure as rusting skeletons for a while longer than an earthen ditch in Acre. Perhaps not. Oceans rise, forests reclaim, sand and vines are patient. The Amazon's lost civilization is, among other things, a quiet reminder that erasure is always closer than it feels. It's also a reminder that history itself is not a finished ledger. For decades, textbooks and encyclopedias carried a relatively simple story. The Amazon was marginal to the great dramas of human civilization. Too poor in nutrients, too hostile, a sideline of small, scattered groups while real history unfolded elsewhere. Now, in the space of a single scholarly generation, that story has started to come apart. New tools, new collaborations, and the persistence of indigenous knowledge are forcing us to redraw maps in our heads, as well as on paper. Forests that were once backdrop become foreground. Peoples once treated as footnotes move to the center of the narrative. And if this can happen here, if a 1,000,000-person civilization can be missed, denied, then suddenly half seen, what else might we be overlooking? In other rainforests, in other so-called margins, in the gaps where written records are thin, or where the winners of old conflicts decided that someone else's past was not worth remembering. In the end, the Amazon does not just hold a secret about itself. It holds a secret about us, about how partial our stories always are, how much of the human past still lies, quite literally, beneath our feet, waiting for a road cut, a LIDAR survey, a remembered song to bring it, briefly, back into view. And as we stand at this juncture, discovering and destroying, listening and forgetting, the question is not only what happened to them, it is what future eyes will see, or fail to see, when they look for us. At night, the forest changes its voice, the heat softens, the canopy breathes, insects stitch a constant, gentle hum through the dark. Somewhere far off, a branch cracks as them moves. Monkey, tapir, jaguar, you can't say. Rivers slide past in the blackness, unseen but always there, carrying leaf fragments, fish, and the slow memory of the hills. Beneath all of that, beneath the roots of giant trees, beneath the tangles of lianas and the patient work of termites, there are other layers, sherds of broken pots pressed flat by centuries of falling leaves, charcoal from old hearths, each fleck once part of a particular fire on a particular night, post holes where houses stood, the faint lines of ditches and embankments blurred now into the general rise and fall of the ground, like the ghost of a handwriting nobody has read in a very long time. Somewhere under your imagined sleeping place tonight, under your home, your street, your town, there are also traces of other lives, different forests, different rivers, different people. The Amazon is not unique in that sense. It is just a place where the veil grew especially thick and where we are only now learning how to lift it. The arc of this story bends quietly. For centuries, voices from the forest, indigenous accounts, the observations of early travelers, were set aside, doubted, overwritten. The region was framed as empty, marginal, a green backdrop without its own deep history. Then came the hints, the strange soils, the earthworks, the regularities in what had seemed random. And slowly the narrative shifted, from dismissal to curiosity, from denial to rediscovery, from silence toward a cautious willingness to listen, to archaeologists, to satellite images, to elders whose stories never entirely forgot that there were towns under those trees. What was once nowhere becomes, in retrospect, a very particular somewhere. If you've stayed with this story all the way here, from vanished roads to dark earth to LIDAR maps and oral histories, you've been part of that turning. Just by listening, by letting your mental map of the world redraw itself a little, you've made space for those long, quiet lives to matter again. If you'd like to help this kind of gentle history reach more people, you can, in a small way, nudge the algorithm in our favor. A tap on the like button, a comment, a subscription. All of that really does make a difference. And if you feel like sharing, I'd love to know. Where are you listening from? Which corner of the world is your own night unfolding in, as you hear about these distant forests? If your mind is still wandering, and you'd like to keep drifting through hidden pasts, there's a sleepy time history book waiting for you as well, about prehistoric secrets, bottlenecks, and forgotten beginnings. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com whenever you feel curious again. For now, you don't need to remember every date or every theory. You can let the details blur, the way paths disappear into undergrowth after you pass. Just hold on to the feeling that the world is older, richer, and more intricate than the simpler stories allow. The Amazon will still be breathing in the dark. The rivers will still be carrying their quiet cargo. The old earthworks will still lie under the roots, patient as ever, and you, for tonight, can let your own thoughts settle like silt at the bottom of a slow stream. Thank you for keeping company with these hidden histories. Rest well, sleep gently. We'll meet again somewhere else in the past.